What's up, Cougar Nation, and welcome again aboard the Hype Train podcast. I'm your host, Joe Wheat. That's at Joey27 on Twitter. As always, with my boy Hunter Miller, and I believe the Hype Train recurring guest of the year, Jackson Payne. Is that official, or do we have other nominees?
We need once Hema Hemuli makes his second appearance, then I think there's a vote that will need to take place. But yeah, a little preview to next week's episode already, where we'll do the Hypey Award nominees. But yes, one of the nominees is with us.
Hema, if you're listening, there is an open spot for the nominee, and Jackson Payne is shaking in his boots right now.
Come on, I got to be the unanimous pick. I got to go full sweep. I need that for the cred,
But it's gonna feel so much better if you actually beat someone out to do it.
No, dude.
Which honestly, who else could we want?
Winning by default is the greatest feeling in the world. Just you're the one and only,
That's the old Jaden Daniels Rookie of the Year. We just win by default because Caleb Williams sucks and the Patriots are a disaster.
Exactly.
He's a system quarterback. But no, dude, I love being on here with you guys. Always happy to join.
So, anything exciting happened today?
Depends on who you ask.
How has your guys' day been? Anything interesting happened in the last 3 days?
Yeah, Jackson's coming off a playoff berth and the winningest season of Washington football in his lifetime.
Dude, Commanders game.
I had the best football weekend ever. I'm just gonna say that.
Yo, did you guys see that tweet from the Falcons fan who was like, when the Falcons were ready to set up for that field goal, and the guy was like, young Hoku, bring us home. Wait, who's this white guy? No!
Oh, did you see that video? It was the Falcons fans at the Atlanta bar, and they're watching it on the big screen, and they thought the field goal was good, and so they celebrate for 30 seconds, and then somebody has to tell them that it was short.
Dude, it looked good, and then it looked good only because I didn't know there were NFL kickers that couldn't make a 54-yarder. You know who can make a 54-yarder? Will Ferrin.
Feel the thrill.
Future Falcon, maybe?
People are asking, future 49er, if today's today's game is any indication. Where do we start? Do you want to talk about the first awesome thing that happened, the second awesome thing that happened, or the third awesome thing what do we want to do?
I think chronological order is the move here.
All right.
I was gonna say reverse. I was gonna say go with the most recent, but we'll go with the guest. Jackson says chronological. Let's do that.
I'm an award-winning guest, so you gotta bend over.
Not an award-winning host.
Look, BYU shoved Colorado into a locker. That's about the best way I can describe it. And shoved them into a locker with the number one quarterback in next year's NFL draft, with the Heisman Trophy winner. I know there was a little bit of disappointment when BYU, when it was announced they weren't playing in the Pop-Tart Bowl, because let's be honest, I think we all would have really enjoyed watching Jake Retzloff bite into a cinnamon roll Pop-Tart the size of my house. But looking back, I think this is kind of the best case scenario. I can't think of a better thing to happen to BYU than to have 7 million people tuning in to watch that game and BYU just beating the brakes off them, and then having Shannon Sharp and Chad Ochocinco after the game talking about the new BYU where we got white boys with track speed.
After watching AJ DeBansa commit on First Take, which is co-hosted by Shannon Sharp, was not expecting that he would be like the most gracious media member and most complimentary towards BYU within the ESPN building. Here we are.
He did play for Brian Billick, so maybe he connected those dots. Maybe he's got a soft spot. Probably not, but I'm just throwing it out there.
I don't know. Was it the absolute best case scenario given the circumstances? 1,000% yes. Personally, I still think there's a case to be made that beating up on Miami in the Pop-Tart Bowl would have been awesome as well. Maybe not as awesome just because we now know that Cam Ward is a pansy and decided to quit on his team halfway through the game. But had Cam Ward played that entire game, you're still playing a Heisman finalist. You're still playing a top 2, maybe NFL draft pick. What I think is a better Miami team as a whole, as a cumulative, 3 phases football team than Colorado is. And you're not playing a conference opponent. You're playing a team that was in the playoff consideration for pretty much 10, 11 weeks of the season. And you get to eat a giant Pop-Tart at the end of the game. Like, I think all of those things considered, that still, in my mind, it would have been a better bowl game for BYU to have gone to. But considering that wasn't reality and that they had to play in the Alamo Bowl against Colorado, like, this was, like you said, Joe, like the picture perfect way that it could have gone.
Yeah, I'm on Joe's side here. I think, the Pop-Tart Bowl is the most fun bowl there is, right? But I think BYU made the Alamo Bowl as fun as it could possibly be because you had so much energy, you had so much life. Just the way, you said they shoved Colorado in a locker. I'd say they shoved them in a locker and then shoved that locker off a cliff, right? Like they did unspeakable things to the Buffaloes. Like that, and just to have for that, it became a national story, like especially with the weird ESPN coverage of it and everyone talking, like everyone kind of just like, I feel like to do it against Prime and Shadur and the Heisman winner and Travis Hunter creates a level of prestige and a level of clout to be able to knock those guys off and do it in such fashion that like beating Miami doesn't really achieve, right? And I feel like, everybody was watching that game. The payout for the Alamo Bowl is way bigger than the Pop-Tart Bowl. So from an admin side, that's a big factor too. But just, how many people can say that they just train wrecked the Heisman winner, right? Like Travis Hunter had 2 good plays, and aside from the game was a liability almost. Like Colorado looked pathetic. Jay Hill like flummoxed them. It was, that was how many BYU beatdowns have you seen like that in your life? Like that was a once in a lifetime type game, I think. And so I think it was the absolute best case scenario.
Asterix as the least deserving Heisman winner that I can remember. But yes, the Heisman winner nonetheless.
But we were pushing that back when it didn't support our narrative. Now that we actually have a narrative to push that involves Travis Hunter being awesome, let me just say it was awesome watching him run down the field and breaking tackles, as long as it was for only 2 plays. And those were really the only 2 meaningful plays. My favorite stat from the game is that Colorado had 210 yards of offense, which was their season low. I think it was 183 yards of that came on 5 plays, and they ran 42. So on the remaining, on the remaining 37 plays, Colorado gained 27 yards, and that is just bonkers. Like, honestly, I can't remember seeing a more dominant defensive performance in my life than that, because it wasn't just like the Kansas State game. For my money, this is the most dominant performance of the season by the defense. The Kansas State game, SMU games notwithstanding, it's awesome to keep those teams out of the end zone. Those were very bend don't, like the SMU game was probably the closest, but like the Kansas State game was very bend but don't break. Kansas State moved the ball pretty well, but just had like a ton of crazy turnovers. This was a season low in available yards gained for the BYU defense this season. Like, I think over half of Colorado's drives ended with 4 plays or less. It wasn't just that Colorado turned the ball over or they had like some fluky things happen. Again, they just got shoved into a locker. Like the poor tackles on Colorado could do absolutely nothing with Isaiah Banya and Tyler Batty and Jack Kelly and Isaiah Glasgow. They were just in the backfield the entire game. And so just again, it's a lot more satisfying for me to watch BYU dominate Colorado at full strength when the entire country thought that the game would look the complete opposite, where BYU would have nothing for Colorado. I think that's more satisfying for me than beating a Miami team that didn't have Cam Ward for a half, or Xavier Restrepo, or 2 of their other top 3 receivers. Like this, for me, if we're looking for BYU to have the most clout going into the offseason, I think BYU just did it. Because right now the narrative is, oh my gosh, I didn't realize BYU had those kind of athletes.
Bingo.
Right now the narrative is Travis Hunter and Shadur, what an impact they had at Colorado.
which is fair.
Unless you're watching the weird Chad Johnson, Shannon Sharp late night after dark podcast. I think
Which-
they're
which
the
is-
only two that have pushed that narrative outside of this podcast studio.
And
Which
the
is- but which is fair. Like I listened to the Cover 3
narrative-
podcast.
The narrative has been A, Shadur and Travis, what a legacy. Narrative B is ESPN and Dave Pash, what a embarrassment you are to sports journalism and sports broadcasting. You know, the history, the 200-year history of calling sports games over a media platform. And then I think the third narrative is, wow, Parker Kingston's pretty fast for a white boy, right? Like those are the three prevailing narratives that I've seen.
But like, what are the prevailing narratives from the Pop-Tart Bowl? Like, is anyone talking about, how awesome Iowa State's offense was?
The prevailing narrative there has been, holy cow, this friggin' bowl game is the coolest thing that
But
we
it's
as
not-
an
but
American
it's not about
society
the-
has to offer.
But it's not about the football. It's about Mario Cristobal giving a super serious interview while the blueberry Pop-Tart is on the big screen behind him running combine
Yes.
drills. Like
Yes.
that, like it's
100%.
Don't get me.
The Alamo Bowl wasn't about football either. It was, wow, what a leader Shadur Sanders is.
I mean, the Alamo Bowl, the Pop-Tart Bowl became about Cam Ward. Like it became about him sitting out. Like big fan of the Cover 3 podcast. They probably spent 10 to 15 minutes talking about the merits of opting out before the game versus the game. They spent zero time
during the game.
Yeah, they spent zero time discussing the actual football game. And then when it came to the Alamo Bowl, all they said was what were the big surprises of bowl week? And Tom Fornelli says that BYU kicked Colorado's butt. And that was it. Like that was the only analysis they had from it, which honestly, I'm okay with. I am okay with that being the only analysis they have, because now going into the offseason, like that's going to be the lasting memory people have of BYU, rather than, oh, they just played a Cam Wardless Miami. Oh, and they ate a Pop-Tart at the end. So like, but I get your point. Like Pop-Tart Bowl is the peak of the pinnacle of human society. Don't get me wrong. But
bowl
in terms
wins
of
come and
on-field
go.
stuff,
Bowl wins come and go. Eating a live Pop-Tart the size of Andy Reid, that was forever.
The Andy Reid.
That's just the reality of bowl. Like this, not to take away, because again, like this was, I think, probably the best game BYU played all year. It was the most complete game that they played
awesome?
all year. It's insane the fact that their two probably best defensive performances in the last decade have both come this year, holding the SMU offense out of the end zone and then shutting down Shadur Sanders and Travis Hunter, with the exception of two plays. With that said, I just think the narrative out of every single bowl game that isn't a college football playoff bowl game is just kind of, I think everyone kind of takes results with a grain of salt. Like it's really, really cool as the fan base. But like when Soljay Maiyava was balling out against SMU in the New Mexico Bowl, no one was like, wow, Soljay Maiyava could be the guy.
Well, he completed
football team once Jaron Hall's done.
He completed like 6 passes, though. You can't compare.
He was the bowl game MVP.
Well,
MVP.
My counter to that is, because of how dominant BYU was in that game, one of the narratives that came out after it from the national audience, from the Reddit college football page from Dan Walken, was, wow, maybe BYU should have gotten more of a look at the playoff. To which I respond, people were talking about it. This guy was talking about it. Those guys were talking about it. No one was listening, because no one cared. Because again, Miami was the hot thing. Alabama was the hot thing. And for some reason, here's little old BYU that, I get they stumbled in November, but they didn't stumble nearly as bad as everyone thinks. Like for some reason, Kansas turned into the 85 Bears for like 3 random weeks. And the team they looked worst against was BYU. And then BYU took a playoff team to the wire in Arizona State. Like those losses weren't as bad as everyone thought, but for some reason BYU dropped like 14 spots in the playoff poll after losing those 2 games. And then BYU finishes off with their best performance of the year and honestly validates everything that we've been saying about them all year, that this is a really good football team, that they do have the talent to stack up with Heisman Trophy winners and top flight NFL draft picks. Like that's what the Alamo Bowl taught us. It's just a bummer that it was 3 games too late. But the good news is because that's the narrative now going into the off season, and like preseason rankings matter, right? And like, because BYU beat Colorado the way that they did and have as much talent coming back as they do, now we're looking at BYU maybe with a top 20 ranking coming into the preseason. And that's a decent starting point. Whereas if you lose to Colorado, I think you're outside the top 25 altogether, because it's just another like, oh, see, BYU, they had a nice start, but fizzled down the stretch.
Yeah, I think, like you said, like I don't think they stumbled as bad as everyone says they did. I mean, if the pooch punt doesn't work as perfect as it could against Kansas, and Arizona State doesn't pull off a perfect onside kick, if one of those 2 things don't happen, BYU's probably in the playoff. And the thing is, if BYU had made the playoff this year, it would have been awesome. We would have been hyped. Like, it would have been a great story. But like, how far would BYU have gone? We'll never really know. But like, based on the results we've seen, like, probably wouldn't have gone so great. But now you have an opportunity where BYU played like a playoff team against Colorado. The world was watching. Everyone's going, wait, what was this with BYU? Is BYU the snub that was out there and that we forgot about? And then you go into next year, you have a preseason ranking. You kind of have this prestige as a program to where you're not little old BYU, right? Like you have a little bit of you've made some deposits in the bank that you can lean on. And so if BYU loses a game or 2 next year, but they have a decent resume and they go to the Big 12 title game, they could be a playoff team. And also, like, from a program culture standpoint, I was talking to a player who was telling me how, Jay Hill makes the players believe in a way that they just don't. Like, Jay Hill does something to those players. And so to take the number 1 quarterback in this draft class and to take a Heisman Trophy winner and just embarrass them. Like, you can look at Colorado. You can't really say that Shedeur didn't have it that night. BYU, like, made him not have it. BYU flummoxed it. BYU put him in hell. Like,
well, and he still finished 16 of 23 for like 200, like it's like 200 yards or 208 yards because they only had 2 yards rushing.
It's not like he was that bad. It's that BYU made him look bad, right? Like, BYU just was so much better than he was. And I think that's something that builds in the offseason. And as you add these guys in the portal that start seeking out BYU because of what they see and the culture they see and what they want to be part of, right? Like, you kind of build this team. And I think the fact that they didn't make the playoff this year in the long run helps them, because next year you can go in and actually expect to make noise in the playoff because you've built, you've stumbled a bit. You've had to overcome adversity. You've had this coronation on the Alamo Bowl stage, right? Now you could go into next year and really embrace that chip on your shoulder. Like, hey, we fell out of it last year. We control our own destiny this year, and we know that we can do it because look what we did to Colorado. Look what we did to SMU last year. Like, BYU knows it can belong, and I think more importantly now, the general public knows that BYU can belong and that BYU won't be scoffed at in the playoff picture and playoff discussion.
Would you rather be Indiana, who made the playoff and lost
This is a good question.
Lost to the point that Kirk Herbstreit was on national television questioning your entire program's existence? Or would you rather be BYU, that didn't make the playoffs but won so convincingly in their bowl game against a top team and top players to the point where everyone on the national scale is questioning why you weren't considered more seriously for the playoffs? Because dude, I think
that's a hard question.
Oh, it's easier for me.
Because I think like it hurts.
I think I'd rather miss the playoff.
Like it hurts.
It's crazy, but
it like making the playoff is what everyone, essentially not named Ohio State, Oregon, kind of aspire. Like, their expectation is to win the playoff, but most other teams' expectation is just like, let's get to the playoffs and maybe win a game or 2. Indiana did that. They made the playoffs in a season no one thought that they would, but they lost so, lopsidedly that now I think that there's a lot of questions where it's like, if Indiana next year turns around again under Coach Cignetti and goes 11-1 again, like, I think there's going to be a real conversation of like, we can't let them into the playoff again. Like, we were 11-1 last year. We let them in and look what happened. I think that there's that sort of there's going to be a hesitancy to allow them into the playoff again unless they win their conference or unless they have an incredible season where they beat Ohio State and they beat Penn State and all this other stuff. Whereas with BYU, you might be looking at a 10-2 season again next year. And I think that if you beat enough good teams like you did this year, that there's a real conversation of like, yeah, they're 10-2, but they're still deserving maybe kind of a playoff spot, depending on obviously how those games transpire. But it's an interesting place to be.
Well, I think you're right, because like the thing that BYU didn't have going for it this year was that it happened so abruptly. Like normally, like Utah, not to bring Utah into everything, so let's just use TCU. Like TCU didn't get any respect. Like it's interesting to compare Utah and TCU actually, because TCU joined the Big 12 conference and within like 3 years was competing for championships and had like a 12-1 season.
They were considered the first ever playoff snub,
right? And they were, yeah, and they were still snubbed. And I think TCU still to this day doesn't get the respect that a Utah does, because Utah, it happened so gradually. Like Utah started out with, multiple losing seasons, and then they worked their way up with 9-win seasons, 8-win seasons. And then when they finally went to the Rose Bowl and just like competed with Ohio State, that was a mark of program respect of, okay, this program worked for it and they've now arrived. Where with BYU this year, it's similar to like the Minnesota Timberwolves last year, where the Timberwolves were like the number 1 seed, like ran through that first round of the playoffs, beat the Nuggets, if I remember correctly. And people were media availability asking like, hey, this happened super suddenly. Like normally you have to like do a little bit of losing before you get to this point. How does it feel? Like that's kind of the attitude that BYU people are having towards BYU right now, where it's not supposed to happen this quickly. Like you're not supposed to just walk into a Power 5 conference and in year 2 win 11 games. It's just not supposed to work that way. And so there was this confirmation bias that, BYU, like they're a cute story. They're 9-0. Oh, look, they lost 2 games. See, they weren't actually all that good. And now with the bowl win, beating a top 25 team by 30 darn near, now going into next season, the narrative is going to be, oh, we didn't actually appreciate BYU enough last year, so now we need to correct for that this year. And I think that's that to your point, Jackson, I think that's actually probably the best thing that can happen for the program. I think going into the playoff when no one thought you were any good and getting your doors blown off by Notre Dame, maybe that doesn't happen because I think BYU is good. But if that does happen, I think that sets the program back further than going and winning the Alamo Bowl.
100%. I mean, I'd so much rather be BYU than Indiana this year. Thinking about some of the teams from the four, I know the narrative was, the playoff committee messed up. Some of these teams should have been in. There were so many blowouts in the first round. But that's always been the case in the 14 playoff, right? Like we know, like think about the Michigan States or the Washingtons or Notre Dame in the 14 playoff era that just go and they don't belong, or Cincinnati when they went as a G5, right? Like no one remembered those teams because they went and they sucked.
2019 LSU beat Oklahoma in the first round by like 40 points.
Yeah, like
that was the round of 4.
But you think of these like I think Michigan State and Washington in 2015 and 2016 are like the most like the hell's a polar bear doing in Arlington, Texas of the college football playoff of the 4-team era. And I think Indiana kind of fits that mold this year, maybe SMU as well, where at least SMU had a little more of a they done a little bit more, and Indiana was just, they only lost once in the Big Ten, but their schedule wasn't great, and so they let them in, they give them the benefit of the doubt, and now they know not to. And so I think I'd so much rather be a team that's ascending and kind of proved people wrong and can go into next year and build off that, and you're already in the discussion. And I mean, from a defensive standpoint, like you could have a top 5 defense nationally next year, like legitimately after what you saw in the Alamo Bowl and what you're getting now. Like I think I'm going to say it right now. BYU's ceiling next year on defense is top 5 in the country. Like they could be stupid good defensively. And I
mean, they were top 13 this year.
Yeah, but I mean, the 13-5 though is quite a jump, but still, like I think it's going to happen. Like,
so
biggest question is losing Jacob Robinson.
I mean, we'll see what
Right.
happens in the transfer. Like, we'll see what happens in the transfer portal with cornerbacks, right? Like, maybe Smith Snowden actually sees the meltdown which he did see the meltdown. We can confirm maybe he enters in the spring window.
I mean, you're
If-
missing
If
your
there's Snowden on the team, man, that's a pretty nice replacement for what Jacob Robinson does for you.
Yeah, you're losing your top two corners in Mark Collins and Jacob Robinson. Obviously, if you can bring in a transfer like Smith Snowden, and if Trey Alexander can become the guy that kind of everyone wants him to be, Maury Bamba takes that next step.
Hot take: Maury Bamba might have been the second best corner BYU had this year. Like, we don't talk about him because he didn't have. Like, we didn't talk about him because he didn't have the interceptions that Mark Collins did. And Mark Collins was awesome. Like, last year we talked about how that was the best cornerback room in BYU history. That lasted all of about 5 minutes, because this is unequivocally the best cornerback room in BYU history, because Jacob Robinson was a beast, Mark Collins was a beast, and Maury Bamba, being 6'2", running as fast as he does, he had those Colorado receivers clamped, like, all game long. Like, there were a couple plays that I'm thinking of, one where they're streaking down the sidelines and Maury Bamba outran the receiver on the route and almost picked it off. Like, that kid can play. We unfortunately just didn't see him early in the season because of injury, but like, if he gets another year of eligibility back, which it sounds like he is, I think that's your transfer portal cornerback right there. And then you just need to add a Smith Snowden if he enters, or Keontae Scott, who's in the portal right now from Auburn. Like, I don't know. It's Gennaro Guilford. I didn't think the cornerbacks would be very good this year after what they lost. You've completely proven me wrong. Here's a blank check. Do whatever you need to do with it. Like, I trust you. I trust that the cornerbacks are just going to be good.
I think Gennaro has the most deposited in the bank for assistant coaches on defense. I mean, he's what he's done with I mean, to have the corners he did as an independent at BYU is kind of crazy. And then what he's done in the Big 12 already, and making this cornerback room way better than last year's already, despite losing Heckard and who else they lose last year? I can't remember.
Cam Garrett.
Cam Garrett. Yeah, I mean, I think I agree. Maury Bamba greater than Mark Collins, and that's not a slight at Collins. I mean, Mark Collins kind of reminds me of like Caleb Hayes, where like he made plays and you liked what you saw from him, but there's a reason why he was making plays. It was because he was getting targeted, whereas Maury Bamba is not getting targeted. Like, he's flying under the radar because he's doing his job. And so I agree. I think Maury Bamba can be that transfer portal addition. And then, I mean, you know, Trey's got that swagger. Trey he got better as the season went on. Trey could maybe ascend a bit next year. And then if you add one more, like a CB2, CB3 in the portal, like, you're cooking. And if you get Smith Snowden somehow, oh my gosh, like, buy all the stock you can, right?
If Trey and Jonathan Cabella can become the guys that we kind of hope and expect them to be, like, imagine Trey.
I think he will.
Like, Trey I think he already has. If Trey continues to put on some weight, is able to maintain kind of his athleticism and speed. If Cabella can continue to develop and take those next steps as well, like, those two guys being your cornerbacks, like 3 and 4 on a team, is pretty dang good on the defensive side of the ball. And now you're adding guys on the defensive line as well. I mean, this can be the nice segue to the most recent news, but like, the linebackers, unreal. Rumblings of Jack Kelly maybe coming back.
He has to.
No way.
I'm penciling him in already.
Taggart in his junior year, Isaiah Glasker back, like, those 3 guys in the linebacker position. You're adding studs on the defensive line. You're going to lose Batty, obviously, but I think they're bringing in a lot of guys. And then you have young guys like Ephraim Asiata, who this last season, you know, had flashes early in the year when he was getting more snaps, but he'll be in year 2 in the program. Like, there's a lot of young talent because Jay Hill's recruited at such a high level over these last 2 years, where it's like all these young guys that can get in and start getting reps and start developing. I mean, if he can do, again, if like Jay Hill can do this with Weber State transfers and Elisa Tuyaki, Ed Lamb recruits, think of what Jay Hill can do with Jay Hill recruits.
Well, and to talk about like Jonathan Cabella and Darian Alexander, like, their coverage grades, they were both top 10 coverage guys for BYU this year, ahead of Mark Collins. Mark Collins' coverage grade was 66.1. Kabea was 67.1 and Alexander was 68.6. Those are excellent coverage grades. Granted, they only played about 40 coverage snaps apiece, but like when they were in there, they played well. And they played about as well as Maury Bamba and then you have Evan Johnson, who also secretly was our best cornerback according to PFF coverage grade. Like there's a lot to like about this BYU defense next year. And I think that's why the Alamo Bowl means so much, is because it gives you a glimpse of like, oh man, this team could be better next year. Like this team maybe hasn't even scratched the surface, because Isaiah Glasker is only a sophomore. He led the team in tackles for loss, sacks, and interceptions, and he's only a sophomore. That's crazy.
Second in sacks, I think, but yes, point remains.
I think I was going to do top 3 takeaways from the Alamo Bowl from like a pure football perspective instead of like
let's do it.
big picture culture. I had them prepared already. One, LJ Martin is that guy, right? Like LJ Martin's the bell cow. I think we already knew that, but this kind of validated it. He did against Colorado. Like he put the offense on his back because Retzloff wasn't good. 2, the BYU defense could be elite next year. I think we saw the glimpse of it. They had their best showing. I mean, Jay Hill is who we think he is, right? But I think 3rd and most importantly is Isaiah Glasker is – I feel like he kind of flew under the radar for most of the year. Like when he flashed big, but I feel like the defense was such a committee where like, you know, Tyler Batty would do something awesome or Jack Kelly would do something awesome. Jacob Robinson exists. Tanner Wall's a cool story and is doing well, right? Like, but Isaiah Glasker.
Okay, Jackson, back up. You got to give us something better on Tanner Wall.
Tanner Wall is the best safety.
That's your boy.
Right? Like,
yes. Okay. Now we're talking.
I mean, I said he did. I'm trying to be as impartial as possible. Okay. I'm just
no, that's not what we do here.
Look, Tanner Wall is the most underrated story of the year. He wasn't recruited by BYU. He had to recruit them. He had a chip on his shoulder. He came in as Steve Clark offered him between receivers coaches at BYU. He came in as a receiver. He had to fight his way up the depth chart. He became a guy on special teams, switched to defense, overcame an injury, fought off highly recruited freshmen, became the guy, started every game of the year, led the team in interceptions. Like Tanner is that guy. He could be an all Big 12 level safety next year. Super high on Tanner. But the point remains, Isaiah Glasker throughout the season, right, just was so consistently good. And when he was great, he was so just undeniably great. And we saw that greatness in the Alamo Bowl. He's leading the team in tackles. He's one of the best sack guys on the team. He's tied for the lead in interceptions. Like he can do everything. He is so good, and he's only a sophomore. And I mean, he's just the athleticism that he has at that linebacker spot is so covetable, right? Like you want that. Like he is the type of guy when you're playing linebacker, you put on his film to learn things, right? Like this is like he could be the Kyle Van Noy of this defense next year. And what's great about that is you have a Jack Kelly, you have a Harrison Taggart playing the same position as him. You have a revamped defensive line that's just as cash money as it can be with Tanu Voss and all these other studs you're bringing in. You have a guy in Tanner Wall who's as good as it gets at safety at BYU, and Raider Demooney who's going to take a jump this offseason. And then you have a cornerback room that just continues to overachieve and play out of its mind. Like, but I think at the key of it is Isaiah Glasker, and he was so good in that Alamo Bowl. And my biggest takeaway from the Alamo Bowl from a pure football perspective is that Isaiah Glasker, 1, was this team's MVP this year, and 2, is just as good as you'll ever see as a defensive player at BYU. He is so good, and his ceiling is so high, and I'm so excited for what he does next year.
Best linebacker room since.
I mean, we talked through it. Like,
I mean, Jackson rattled them off. It's Kelly, Glasker, Taggart.
And then behind them, you got like Siale Acera, who's balling out.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like, I want to say the linebacker room that had Fred Warner, Sione Takitaki, and a certain player that shall not be named. That was a pretty, and then Butch Pau behind that. Like that was a pretty good linebacker room. So probably since like 2016.
The problem is like the two that come to mind are going to be like 2016 and then maybe like 2012, which I think had Kyle Van Noy. I think it was like Spencer Hadley, Ogletree. I think was Alani Fua in that linebacker room.
He would have been.
So it's like you had 2 NFL guys there. Sports Reference has Ziggy Ansah listed as a linebacker. I don't
Yeah,
know. He kind of
he's a
played that
defensive lineman,
talky
yeah.
defensive end linebacker. If you want to count him, like that's 3 NFL guys. The room you mentioned, Joe, had 2 NFL guys. We'll see. Like they're still young.
I mean,
Glasgow and Taggart are both
Glasgow and
sophomores.
Kelly are 100% NFL guys. Like Kelly was talked about, like the first half of the season, Kelly was being talked about as a top 5 outside linebacker in the upcoming draft. He fell off a little bit, but like with another year of development, I think like he's a freak, man. Like in a combine setting, that guy is going to flash and he is going to get drafted. Isaiah Glasgow with another year, 6'5", 245, runs like that, can catch like that, can pass rush like that. Like put him at tight end, heck. But that's an NFL linebacker that we're looking at with another year.
I agree. They're both young. Like we'll see how
Yeah,
the rest. It's just hard to compare rooms when the other rooms have Van Noy and Fred Warner. They're like 2 of the best NFL linebackers of the last 10 years.
I mean, great. This was the 3rd best linebacker room of the last 20 years at BYU. Like, bummer.
No, I'm just saying, like,
it's just like, look, BYU is linebacker U. BYU is linebacker U. They produce NFL linebackers at a very high clip. So, like, not everything needs to be the best in program history, but like, it's pretty freaking good, and they're all coming back next year. I wanted to kind of pivot to the offense a little bit. Let's start with special teams. Kelly Papinga.
Yeah, I was going to do the same thing. He's so good.
Now, if we want to talk about best in program history, man, this was the best special teams year, I think, in program history. First year since 1971 that you had 5 kickoff/punt returns for touchdowns. You also recovered an onside kick. You executed a fake punt, a fake field goal. Will Farron was perfect outside of 50 yards. He might have missed 1, but I think he went 23 for 26 on the year for field goals. That's insane. Set a program record for field goals in a year. I feel like there's some other things I'm missing on special teams. Like you are legitimately a ball bouncing off Talon Alfrey's leg from being a perfect special team season. And it was honestly like Detroit Lions level of like silliness, where we got Detroit Lions running pass plays for Penei Sewell, not just catching passes but throwing passes. That's the level that we were at on special teams this year, where Kelly Papinga was just in his bag coming up with heaven knows what to get BYU another touchdown. Like there's legitimately an argument that BYU won 3 games this year on the back of their special teams.
They had 2 punt return touchdowns and 3 kick return touchdowns. Like when you have 5 touchdowns from special teams, that absolutely swings 3 games your way.
Mm-hmm.
And 2 fakes that they pulled off worked to perfection in big moments in games. I remember the Vanderhaar run against Baylor worked, and the double snap Farron against UCF worked. Like, so just, I mean, when your fakes work that well, that just it's a testament to your execution in every phase of special teams. Like there was never a special teams worry at all this year, except for obviously the Talon Alfrey incident at Arizona State, which is that I think that was more reflective on Arizona State's game plan and what they called at that moment than BYU's.
It was just bad luck.
That was just bad luck, right? Like that was an Arizona State win for them. But yeah, I mean, when you have 5 return touchdowns, I mean, has BYU had 5 return touchdowns in the past 20 years before this year?
Since 1971. 1971 was the last time.
Oh, I meant total. Like in the past 20 years, do they have 5 returns?
Oh, I mean, probably not.
Like when you score 5 touchdowns in special teams, that swings you a couple games, like you said. I mean, that's Kelly.
We need stats man on that.
Yeah.
Remember when early in the season they were like, "That's not sustainable."
Guess what's
what do you mean they were like?
big fat idiots.
Of course I know him. He's me.
Can I?
Will Farron 41. Will Farron 41 for 41 on extra points, 24 for 27 on field goals. Also had 1 rush for 8 yards and 1 solo tackle.
Can I tell
a partridge in a pear tree?
Yes, you can tell a story, Jackson.
So at Wyoming, I think Keelan had 2 like unimpressive returns early in the game. And then right as he caught to take the one that he took to the house, when he started to take it out, a media member in the press box from the BYU beat, who shall remain nameless, just started popping off like, oh my gosh, why is he return? BYU should never return kicks. That's not what BYU does. Just take the fair catch every time and just let your offense do the work. And as soon as he said that, Keelan Marion took it to the house for a touchdown. And then BYU proceeded to score 4 more return touchdowns that year.
You don't need to tell us which media member it was, but if you were to tell us which media member it was, who would it have been, hypothetically?
It would have been somebody that I'll tell you after this records.
Great. Sounds good.
You probably know who it is. I mean,
well, we'll have to
I've
do
got
a
a short
subscription
list of
service for the
guesses.
bonus. Yeah, I do too.
That's some inside baseball.
Okay, let's pivot to the offense. I think
LJ
this offense, LJ's a beast.
LJ needs more carries. Do you want to take a guess on how many carries he averages per game over his 2 years at BYU?
9.
Oh, it's under 15. It has to be
12.
Yeah.
12 carries. We are giving this guy, who is, I think, unequivocally our best offensive player, 12 carries a game.
Yeah, which
crazy.
It is crazy. Like, and I think there's some injury stuff that's factored into that a little bit. Like, he was banged up last year.
Well, that's why I'm going carries per game. So just factoring games he's actually playing in, right? But like Tyler Algier, for reference, his last year in 2021 at BYU averaged 21 carries per game.
Yeah, he needs to be closer to like 18, 19 a game at a minimum.
Yeah, 16 to 18, I think.
Like, and I do love Sione Moa. Like that was one of my big takeaways from the game is like next year's running back room of Sione Moa and Pokai Haunga is going to be really good. Like, I think Pokai is a great change of pace back. He redshirted this year, but he flashed when he was on the field, has some great wiggle to him, has some great speed. But LJ Martin's your bell cow, man. Like, if you want to, if you're going to, A-Rod has shown that he is committed to the run game and he is going to run the ball 30 to 35 times a game. That's what he wants to do. LJ needs to be getting at least 2/3 of whatever your carries are per game. And if you want to switch it up and go with two running back sets, like we've seen BYU do this year, if you want to switch it up and, go with the change of pace guy, that's great. But watching LJ run through the Heisman Trophy winner and drag him 5 yards into the end zone, that's the guy that you're getting when he's fully healthy. He's amazing. His vision, he routinely turned 3-yard losses into 10-yard gains against Colorado, and he's done that all year. His vision is amazing. Like, he is the guy that BYU needs to run through.
He led the team in touchdowns and was second on the team, 60 yards behind a leader, Chase Roberts, in yards from scrimmage. And again, like, this is a running back trailing a wide receiver.
Who only played
and he did it in 3 less games. 10 games.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm not counting SMU because he carried the ball 5 times on the first drive and
so 9 games in essence. I mean, you could discount maybe Chase's bowl game if you want to do that.
So we'll call it 3 games.
So we'll call it even. We'll say 3 games, and he still led the team in touchdowns, doubled the next like skill position guy. Jake was second. He had 6 rushing touchdowns. But I mean, he like led your team, and he did it in a third less of the time out there.
You know what's crazy is like how our preseason, like when we were talking about, okay, what does BYU need to do with the bowl game, like do to get to a bowl game? You need to ride LJ Martin, which they did. Jake Retzloff just needs to be like a 20 touchdown, 10 interception guy, which he was. The defense needs to take a big step forward, which they did. And that was what we thought needed to happen to get to 6 wins. They got to 11. So maybe we were just like underselling how good this team could be if any of those things happened. But like, it's just funny how the season turned out exactly like we hoped it would with 5 additional wins.
You guys should have aimed higher. Like, Jake Retzloff is Vince Young 2.0 and LJ Martin is Marshawn Lynch. And
like this might be a discussion for the offseason. We know LJ is great. BYU's offensive line was awesome against a very good Colorado defensive line, who was I think they were top 10 in sacks this year. And BYU's offensive line gave up like 4 pressures total. That's incredible. And like 3 of the offensive linemen are coming back, with Andrew Gentry, Michigan's starting left tackle, coming in. Like, offensive line is in a great spot. let's talk about Jake. He was bad against Colorado. And like but the funny thing is, like, I went back and watched the game again, and Retzloff like wasn't as bad as I remember him being. There is a great quarterback in there. I believe it. But for some reason, for like 3 or 4 plays a game inside the 25-yard line, he just like acts like he's on cocaine and just forgets how to play the position. And it's cost BYU multiple touchdowns.
He's got a little Brett Favre in him, in a, I think, era of quarterback play where you can't be Brett Favre anymore and expect to be like a Hall of Fame quarterback like Brett Favre was. Right? Like, does that make sense? Where it's like he's a little too careless at times and tries to just like gunslinger mentality, where like defenses are too good. Defensive backs can actually catch now. It's not the 90s and early 2000s. And like those kind of mistakes are things that will cost you games. And I think he's got to learn, especially in that, that interception that both interceptions where it was the tunnels or the little tight end underhand shovel pass screen, which I don't like the play call. That's something you run at the 2-yard line, not at the 22-yard line.
Which I would count it as a drop. Like it hit Swanson in the hands. I don't like. Sorry, go ahead.
But between that play and the play that he threw the interception in the end zone, like he's got to just learn that there are worse outcomes than an incomplete pass or a sack, right? Like sometimes he's got to, instead of like, there's nothing open, let me just fire this ball into triple coverage in the back of the end zone from 30 yards out. Like that, there's a worse outcome of that play than the ball falling incomplete. And unfortunately, like it seems to happen more often than not where he makes those kind of plays and it ends up going the other way. Fortunately, it didn't cost BYU. It cost BYU points. It didn't cost them the game, but it is like sometimes it's a little too much recklessness.
Well, and there's a very specific set of circumstances. Like the Jake Retzloff experience is when he's not being pressured against zone coverage, he's legitimately a top 10 quarterback in the country. Like in terms of passer rating, in terms of PFF, like he is an awesome quarterback when he knows what's coming and he can pick you apart. But the problem is as soon as he gets blitzed or once he faces man coverage, he's one of the worst quarterbacks in the country. And that's kind of been the Jake Retzloff experience this year, where like against teams like Utah and against teams like Colorado, who run a ton of man coverage, he was awful. But against teams like UCF, against teams like even to some extent Kansas State, I thought he was excellent. All those teams run heavy zone coverage, didn't bring a lot of pressure. I actually thought he was better against Arizona State than like he obviously threw the game losing interception, but for the most part, like until that final drive, he was nails and brought BYU back in that game. But again, Arizona State doesn't pressure you a lot and they run a lot of zone coverage. So,
I mean, from a yards perspective, Arizona State was his second best game.
Yeah. But when I look at his stats this year, finished with nearly 3,000 yards passing, 58% completion percentage, 8 yards an attempt, 20 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, 136 quarterback rating. That is exactly what I hoped he would be. Like that, like the high end of what I thought Jake Retzloff could be. That was it. It's just a bummer that it felt like he got worse as the season went on. And like, there had to have been some kind of a health issue. Like I know he was banged up banged up like really bad in the Utah game, but like next year's season, if he takes another step forward like he did this year, because he took a step forward, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
If he has an equal step forward to what he had this year, BYU is a playoff team, 100%, because the skill positions, the offensive line, the running back room, the defense, like all of those pieces are playoff worthy. It's just, can Jake Retzloff eliminate those 3 to 4 big mistakes that he makes in the red zone every single game, especially at the end of the season? If he can, sky's the limit for this BYU team. If he can't, we're probably looking at 10 wins.
Yeah.
Like like a similar season to what we had, if not worse, because maybe the ball doesn't bounce your way as much as it did this year and you end up with 8. Like like the team. Moral of the story: the team ceiling is 100% dependent on Jake Retzloff, and I just don't know if he's hit his ceiling or not. The coaches seem to think he hasn't, and so that's the bet that they're making.
Yeah, I mean, he made a huge step forward this year. Like, irregardless of how he ended the year, which, to your point, Joe, he ended the year poor considering how he started the year. 4 of his 5 lowest rated games were the last games were against Houston, Kansas, Utah, and Colorado. Colorado being his lowest rated game. Colorado was the only game that he didn't throw a touchdown but threw interceptions. He had 2 other games against Utah and Houston where he had no touchdown passes, but he at least didn't throw picks in those games. And then Colorado, I think, was also his second fewest yards. The only game where he had fewer passing yards was against Kansas State. And that's because the defense was giving them fields of 20 yards and they were running the ball a lot in the second half. So to your point, like, did not finish the game strong. I saw it, or did not finish the season strong. I saw a tweet afterwards that was like, finally, like, Jake has silenced the doubters. I don't think the Colorado game where you threw for 0 touchdowns, 2
yards.
picks, 150 yards on 57% completion, and had your only sub 100 quarterback rating game of the year is necessarily the game that silenced the doubters. But that's just me. I do think
what we saw was against Colorado. That was literally 2023 Jake Retzloff. That is exact, like 98 quarterback rating. That's who he was last year. And so, to your point, like, is that who he is? I don't think so, but it's not encouraging that your last 2 games of the season, you finished 8 for 19 with 167 yards, no touchdowns, no picks, and his passer ratings the last 5 games of the season: 101, that's bad; 126, that's not great; 135, that's fine; 115, that's bad; 98, that's awful. Like that's how he finished the year.
Yeah, I mean, the only game that he's thrown that from last year that he threw less yards was that Iowa State game than the Colorado game. And it was 5 degrees and the game was over by halftime.
I want to say a lot of his faltering down the stretch had to do with health, just because he does have that very Brett Favre-ish quality of just throwing your body into every play, which is it's admirable at times, but like you don't want your offense to be tailored around just killing yourself on every play, right? Like they've got to coach some of the recklessness out of Jake in terms of physicality. Mm-hmm. And I think that'll go a long way. Like if you can get his completion percentage up from like 58 to like 63, I think that extra 5%. I know it might sound like a tall task, but like that's huge, right? Like that would go so far for third downs, for staying on the field longer, for not throwing picks, right? And I think more than anything, instead, this guy can't be training in Southern California anymore. We got to send this guy to Rexburg, Idaho, train in negative 20-degree Fahrenheit weather. Like I need you to be able to withstand Lavelle Edwards Stadium in November. I need you to be able to play when it gets cold, because I'm not sure he can do that.
Well, it's the difference between him being a 58% passer and a 63% passer is 20 completions. If BYU had an extra 20 completions this year, they're undefeated. Because like the game, like the incompletions that I'm thinking of are the misses to Darius against Kansas for what would have been a touchdown. I'm thinking of the missed hole shot to JoJo, and we can debate that all we want, but like those are the plays that cost BYU an undefeated season this year. And I don't think it's all Jake Retzloff's fault. Honestly, I like the undefeated season. That was a team effort to lose those games. But if we're trying to project into next year, I feel really confident about everything that I feel like the entire team is going to take a step forward. I'm just wondering if Jake is going to take that step forward, because again, if they do, this is a special BYU team that's coming back next year.
Would you rather him increase his completions, or, I mean, this is a dumb question. Would you rather him increase his completion percentage next year to 65 or decrease the amount of games in which he had 2 or more interceptions?
I would
1,000%
multiple picks. give me the more hits than fewer misses, because the problem was he didn't have enough hits this year. The 12 interceptions I can live with. Like that. That's not that bad. I think Jaron had 9 his last year at BYU. Like the 12 interceptions, I don't have a huge problem. It's the fact that your highest touchdown game of the season was 3
Against Baylor.
And you threw 2 picks in that game. But the rest of the season, you're after, like, from Arizona on, it was 2, 2, 2, 0, 1, 1, 0, 0. Like, I need more touchdowns from you. I need more hits. If you want to throw 12 picks, that's fine, but you got to give me 25 to 30 touchdowns. And that was the difference this year. So if he increases his completion percentage up to 65, we're getting those extra 5 touchdowns.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, you're probably right, but like 5 games of multiple picks is tough.
I mean, the funny thing is, like, BYU won 3 or 4 of those 5 games.
I mean, BYU was just winning most of their games anyway.
But
I mean, SMU, you had 1 touchdown, 2 picks. Oklahoma State, you had 2 touchdowns, 2 picks. Arizona State, 1 touchdown, 2 picks. Colorado, 0 touchdowns, 2 picks. And then you had the Baylor game that you mentioned where he had 3 touchdowns, but then he had 2 picks that kind of let Baylor back into the game a little bit.
Yeah, if we're talking like weak links of the offense, I think your biggest weak link is Jake. Like, I don't want to,
which is like not the weakest link to have.
Which like, again, like you have an average quarterback. Like in terms of ESPN QBR, he's what, 60th in the country in QBR. That's average. Like, yeah, great. Like we wanted him to be average, and he was average. Congratulations.
And we saw what happened. But now it's hard not to let ourselves dream of like, well, what if he's above average in 2025, you know?
Which I think he can get there with another season of development, another season of film, and honestly, another season of being the guy, developing with your receivers where you're not splitting reps, because a lot of the problems that he had this year is he just was not on the same page as a Darius Lassiter. He wasn't on the same page as a JoJo Phillips or a Keelan Marion. If you can get in the lab with those guys and you know exactly where they're going to be and exactly where Jake is going to put the ball on every single play, that's going to help out a ton, because I saw Darius a lot this year stop running on routes because he wasn't sure where that ball was going to be. And if he kept running, Jake would have hit him in stride. Like we saw it against Colorado. There was a deep shot where ball bounced in the end zone and Darius stopped too early. And if he kept running, it hits him in the hands. Like that. It's that kind of stuff where I think with another off season, I think that stuff can get fixed.
Yeah, I think Darius developed a lot more chemistry with Gary Bohan in the offseason, and that's a result of splitting quarterback reps until the week before the game. In Jake's defense, I will say the weak link was actually the tight ends, but now you have Carson Ryan transferring from Utah to BYU, so the tight ends should hopefully be better. And again, like, this isn't a knock on Jake. I agree, where it's like he's probably, as in terms of like what contributes to wins and losses, tight ends, I am unlike some BYU fans in the sense that I don't think targeting your tight ends is necessarily what's going to win or lose you football games. Quarterback play absolutely does. And in terms of what's contributing to wins and losses, I do think QB play for BYU is probably the weak link. It's definitely weaker than I think the offensive line was this year, or what the offensive line will be this coming year with Gentry coming in from Michigan. I think it's absolutely weaker than the running back room or the quarterback room. And that's not necessarily a knock on Jake, because we wanted him to be average, and he was average. And I think he can be above average. And I still think if he's above average, he'll still be the weakest link. But that's just because LJ Martin, the wide receivers, and the offensive line could be really, really good in 2025.
Yeah.
So it's not even like it's not even like a Jake's bad because he's the weakest position group. It's more just like LJ and the wide receivers, and everyone's awesome. Yeah.
Like, again, like I said at the top, rewatching that game, there is an awesome quarterback in there. The decisions that he made between the 20s against Colorado were awesome. Hunter, you pointed out that there was one pre-snap read that he didn't get right, but for the most part, like every decision that he made, I thought against Colorado was the right one. until again, he gets into the red zone. And for some reason, it's one of those 3 plays where he just decides, I'm going to play hero ball here. And it ends up with a mistake. Like it's not these big wholesale changes that we need. BYU doesn't need to go get another quarterback to start next year in the portal. Like there was enough clay still left to be worked with Jake. And honestly, like with Aaron Roderick's development that he has proven, I think he can get there. Which brings me to my last point on the offense. I feel so vindicated with how good Aaron Roderick was in that Colorado game. Like it's execution, guys. Like a lot of the problems that BYU had on offense this year weren't play calling issues. They were execution. BYU finished top 30 in offensive efficiency this season. So like we can talk about like down to down, like, okay, maybe I wouldn't have made that decision from play call to play call. But for the most part, I thought A-Rod was in his bag.
I think it's probably one of the better games I've ever seen him call, with the exception of a couple of really dumb moves where it's like, let's maybe not bring in Bohannon to like throw the ball towards the end zone.
But
Again,
why
I already
he did
pointed
that?
out that like I don't like the shovel pass.
I think he did that to shut up the fans.
Yes, 100%. Like I tweeted out as soon as that pick was thrown, it's like, well, I guess that answers that question. Like there were seriously fans until the end of the season were like, where's Bohannon? Why can't we see Bohannon?
That's
well,
why.
You saw him. That's why. Which
maybe
again, it wasn't a bad play call.
Do that
This was open.
A-Rod's
open. He just got on his phone.
only win in that situation because it's either A, he throws a pick and you score, or B, he throws a touchdown and you score, or B, he throws a pick and it's like, well, see, I told you, like the BYG was the only way, right? Like,
and then I already said I didn't like the underhand little Mahomes, Travis Kelce.
That like 2 plays that never need to be in Jake Retzloff's repertoire ever again: the shovel pass and the end zone fade.
And again, I don't like, and this is nitpicky because, like I said, I think this was probably the best game Roderick has called that I can remember. So I'm being incredibly nitpicky, but like, what are you hoping that this little like Mahomes Kelce underhand tight end shovel pass is going to accomplish from the 20-yard line? Like that play's never, ever, ever going to go for like 20 yards. It's what you do at the 2-yard line when you're like, let's just catch the defensive line off guard and they can sneak 2 yards into the end zone. Like it's a wild play to be pulling from outside the red zone. But again, those are like the 2 that I can remember that I was like, don't like that. The rest were pretty on point, and he dialed up some incredible, screens and some good 3rd and long conversions. The one where it was the mesh route, but it was almost setting up the screen to Parker Kingston over the middle on that 3rd down. I think it was in the 3rd quarter, was an awesome play design. So like he did really, really well. But it was just, it was like, why are we bringing Bohannon in suddenly now at this point in the season in like the random middle of the 2nd quarter or 1st quarter to throw the ball right now when he hasn't come in and thrown a pass since 2021 at USF?
Yeah, no offensive coordinator, like no matter what, no offensive coordinator is going to bat 1,000. Yeah. But I thought in this game, he was above 90%. And I think for most of the season, I would give him like a B+, in context of where we thought the offense would be and where they were last year. Like they improved a lot, man. I think if you don't, I wouldn't burn down the offense just because BYU lost 2 games in November. I think maybe next time we talk about, next week we go in a little more into like all time, where does the season rank? Because there's other things we need to talk about, starting with Keanu Tanevasa. If I had to pick a single transfer portal player for BYU to get this year, it would have been Keanu Tanevasa, and they got him.
BYU going grocery shopping in the aisles of Rice Eccles Stadium is pretty awesome.
Dude, that like, and
I don't care if they're paying
Dave McCann. Dave McCann
prices.
Wasn't wrong. Dave McCann wasn't wrong. He was just early. All those 0 for 3 tweets that I saw like 3 days ago, because like, and everyone was wondering like, oh, what are the 3? Like, you're gonna miss on Tanuvasa, but like, who are the other 3? Because no one in BYU circles was talking about Lander Barton. No one in BYU circles was talking about him. And Utah fans are coming out here saying, well, actually, BYU offered Lander Barton over $1 million to enter the portal. To do what? Lander Barton wouldn't crack the top
Isaiah
5
Glasker's
linebackers on this team, man.
To be Isaiah Glasker's backup.
And like, don't get like
BYU's not dumb, right? Like, why would you throw $1 million at a kid whose parents are Utah people? Like, they played at Utah. All his brothers played at Utah. Like, why would
there's like 5 other players I would rather throw. And it's because they have this conspiracy theory that BYU is just trying to like destabilize the program now by offering all these legacy kids just to send a message, not to build the best roster, but to send a message, which honestly, I wish that was true. I wish that BYU was throwing bags at players they didn't need just to send a message to Utah, because that's the kind of stuff I would be doing if I was running the BYU football program. Fortunately, there are smarter people out there than me that are running the program.
Utah fans think that the way to have a great offseason is to raid a 5-7 team. It's all what they did to New Mexico, and now they think BYU is going to try and do the same thing to them. And there's a reason you went 5-7. BYU doesn't. There's a few guys you can pick out, and they'll play well at BYU, but you don't want there's a reason they're a 5-7 team.
Look, it's all manufactured. Like it's all a manufactured win, and it all notice it all started popping up when after Tanuvasa entered the portal. Because when Tanuvasa entered the portal, here's kind of the timeline events. He enters, and by the way, I was told like 3-4 weeks ago that Puha, like, he wasn't offering defensive tackles just in case Tanuvasa entered the portal. Like, that was his golden calf. That is who Puha wanted. And so he was just kind of waiting, biding his time, seeing if Tanuvasa would enter the portal. When it appeared that he didn't, he offered Anisi Purcell, I think is how you pronounce it. We signed him, and then all of a sudden, out of the blue, Tanuvasa enters the portal, and everyone looks really smart. So Tanuvasa enters, Utah fans go into a frenzy, and immediately the Utah media starts pushing, oh, he's going to go to USC. That's who got him to the portal. And then those rumors fizzle out, and I'm hearing the entire time, yeah, he's coming to BYU. And then USC fizzles out, and then all of a sudden it becomes, well, actually, it's not just Tanuvasa, it's Smith Snowden, it's Lander Barton. Like, BYU's throwing bags at these guys, trying to get them to the portal. They're offering 2 to 3 times as much as what Utah is paying them. To which the first I say, that's not the flex that you think it is. Poverty programs do that kind of stuff. Like, if BYU has $1 million to throw at a corner, that should make you really nervous. But it's all a manufactured number. It's a manufactured thing to say, hey, we might have lost this one guy to the portal, but they chased 2 other guys that were really important to us, and they didn't get them. Utah wins, BYU sucks, because they couldn't get Smith Snowden for 3 times the NIL. To which I say, if BYU had $1 million to throw at a cornerback, do you think they would have gotten outbid by Alabama for Cam Calhoun, who was actually in the portal? I don't. And so it's all just a manufactured win. It's a PR spin, all of it. Smith Snowden was never going to come to BYU. Maybe he does now after seeing the meltdown. But Lander Barton, never going to come to BYU. Who is coming to BYU? A very important player, their best defensive player for my money at BYU's most important position of need. And that is a huge win for BYU on the field and off the field, because it signifies there is no player on Utah's roster that is untouchable, that times are truly different in the rivalry, where Happy learned how to putt. The brother you had a 10-year head start. That head start evaporated in like 12 months.
It's funny you mentioned Happy learned how to putt, because when they got Tanuvasa today, that's literally the first thing that went through my mind. I was like, oh boy, like, it's the tables have turned, the winds of change have come in, and Dave McCann rides in the correct club. But that was, getting Tanuvasa is just, from a football perspective, it's huge, right? Like, he was such a big playmaker on that D-line for Utah. To have a guy that can create pressure up the middle will be so huge. We talk about the cornerback room at BYU being a little limited right now. Like, they could add another portal. Guys could take a step up. But I think the D-line being better, like, obviously you lose Batty, you lose Nelson, you lose Mangelson, but Hunter Clegg and Akana and Tanuvasa, like, these are disruptive players, and you bring a couple guys back. Like, this is disruption that could put quarterbacks into pressure situations and force them to throw into bad coverage, right? Like, this could be an awesome experience to see BYU finally win at the line of scrimmage on defense every single play. So I'm stoked. This is one of my favorite pickups BYU's had in the offseason, and as far as I can remember, right? Like this is a huge deal. It can't be understated.
Breaking news.
Let's hear it.
A certain reporter, as I was scrolling through the tweets, because I was trying to find a specific reply from a Utah fan that was going through and being like, guys, not losing 2 players when our best player is leaving for our rival is not the flex you think it is. So I was trying to find the exact tweet so I could do it justice, because that is actually an intelligent Utah fan. But a certain Utah reporter is now private on Twitter and tweets are locked. And that happened within the last 30 seconds.
Well,
As I was scrolling, I suddenly couldn't see the tweets anymore. And I was like, what's going on? And then I went back to, I refreshed and it was like, these tweets are protected. Only approved followers can see. So we're not, so it's not like I'm blocked. It's he legitimately locked it all down.
Look, I am blocked. Okay.
You are blocked.
Probably rightfully so. I've never gone after his character. Much like he has gone after the character of even some players on his own team.
Isaac Wilson
and Tanu Vasa. Like, look,
Tanu Vasa.
And then he goes on to the Locked On Utes podcast today, this morning, and talks about how BYU doesn't, they're promising these big money deals and BYU doesn't follow through on them. Yeah, that's why Chase Roberts is coming back for another year. That's why Caleb Etienne could come back for another year. Like, if that was true, BYU would have an exodus to the portal every single year. And they would have had an exodus to the portal last year when they went 5-7. And there were people coming for Chase Roberts. There were people coming for Jacob Robinson. And BYU kept their services. Like, it's all copium. It is all lies and narrative spinning to say, hey, look, guys, it's not Utah's fault. Like, BYU is making these absurd promises that they can never follow through on. That's why we're losing guys. No, you're losing guys because your culture sucks. Because the moment, like, it's all family on three until someone enters the portal and we got guys calling Keanu Tadavasa, excuse my language, mom, mute this, a bitch. Like, that is what your fan base is calling your own players because they leave. And it all starts from the top down. The all-in are in the way. That sounds great. That sounds absolutely great on the surface until you got guys who all of a sudden don't feel as valued and they leave and it's okay, we're shutting the door on you forever. Meanwhile, like, Micah Harper enters the transfer portal and we got pictures of him crying with Kalani Sitake because he's so sad to leave. Like, there is a substantial difference between the cultures of the two programs right now. And it's why we're seeing a flow from one program to the other. And after BYU's 5-7 season, there wasn't the flow going the other direction.
And this is like a week after they were standing on their heads celebrating how many players and coaches they poached from New Mexico.
Yeah.
Like, it's fine when you do it to New Mexico, but heaven forbid a single one of your guys leaves. And I don't understand. Is it that BYU's offering a bag and they're paying more money than Utah can pay? Or is BYU promising things that they can't actually fulfill on and that they're scamming all their players? Because if a single player, Tanu Vasa, is connected enough to the BYU roster and has enough friends on the coaching staff and on the team that if a single player was promised something that wasn't actually delivered, he would not be coming to BYU to quote unquote chase a bag, because he would know that he wasn't actually going to get that bag. Like, these players talk, they text their friends, they hang out on weekends all the time. There was Raider Demooney today posted a picture of him playing basketball with the Fano brothers. Like, the players are friends. It's not rivalry Twitter. These guys are actually homies. If a single person,
which is sickening, by the way,
not my college football. If a single guy was getting scammed by BYU donors promising money that wasn't actually being paid out, like, that word would travel and you wouldn't see guys entering the portal and coming to BYU. So I don't understand what your narrative is, because neither narrative fits, because you can't fathom that there are players that maybe just don't want to play at Utah anymore, or maybe see BYU as a better destination. They're so convoluted and they're suffering from the brain rot of losing 2 Rose Bowls that they can't fathom that there are other programs out there that might be pretty dang good too, and might be doing something pretty special, and might be building towards something like they thought they were building towards when they were winning Pac-10 championships. And now that it's not them, and now that they can't just be the ones poaching all the other schools and taking recruits, they had no problem with it when it was Logan Fano going from Provo to Salt Lake. They had no problem when Jason Beck left New Mexico to chase a bag to become the offensive coordinator at Utah. They had no problem when New Mexico's quarterback and UNLV's running back left those schools to come to Salt Lake. There was no issue with it. But until a single player from Utah decides to go, you know what? I like what Kalani Sitake is building in Provo. I like what Jay Hill's doing on the defensive side of the ball. There's some uncertainty here with Kyle Whittingham deciding to come back. I still don't think we've gotten an official announcement from Cam Rising. There's a lot of uncertainty up here in Salt Lake, and I see what Kalani and my friends are doing down in Provo, and that looks really fun. And yes, they might give me some more money. I'm going to go do that. Like, they can't wrap their brains around it because they've suffered for the last 14 years of thinking that they're superior to every single one of these other programs. They had more money, and there was no issue with having a full share. Remember the brags that we would get a year ago of like Utah's getting a full share of Big 12 revenue in year one, BYU's only getting 70% or whatever it is. And now it doesn't matter. The trucks, they were
flexing how awesome they were at NIL
about a truck lease from Ken Garf.
Lease.
I haven't seen a single one of those trucks out in the wild.
No, you gotta.
And now BYU said, yeah, we're not getting a full share of the revenue, but you know what? We're still going to go out and we're going to pay our players more, and we're going to do better at NIL, and we're going to build a better roster and build a good program that can actually compete in the Big 12 and not collapse after their second loss with infighting and issues with their quarterback scamming NIL for multiple years in a row. So
it's literally what Connor Pay said: when emotions are high, intelligence is low. And that's exactly what you've seen. That is all you've seen.
Well, and so can we just appreciate for a second the cognitive dissonance that the mustache twirling villain who is going behind their backs and bankrupting BYU's moral mission of being a missionary tool for the church, the number one villain is Kalani Sitake? That's the guy. Coach. That's the guy. Like the evil person that you think is so morally bankrupt,
the mastermind,
is Kalani Sitake, the guy who, while your coach, after the Utah game was going and berating refs, you know who was comforting your players? Kalani Sitake. And you know which two players he comforted? Carson Ryan and Keanu Tanevasa. Guess where they're playing in 2025? BYU. Look inward. Look inward. Who wants to play for that culture? Who wants to play for the culture that all they do is make excuses? Oh, like we went 5-7. It wasn't our fault. The refs were out to get us. Oh, it wasn't our fault. Baylor had a dirty hit on Cam Rising. Oh, it wasn't our fault. BYU is trying to poach all our players and take our program down from within. Nothing is our fault. We're the golden child of the Big 12. It's all excuses. And maybe players don't want to play for that kind of program anymore. Maybe players want to play for, after a team goes 5-7, they put their nose to the grindstone and say, no, we are going to stick with this culture. We are going to stick with this roster. We believe in you, and we are going to turn 5 wins into 10. That is the culture that BYU has, while Utah fans are sitting here making excuses, and their coaching staff is manufacturing wins of, hey guys, it wasn't our fault that we couldn't keep this guy from entering the portal. Like it's all your fault. And then your fan base has the nerve to go out and again, call these players the most vile and upsetting things, to the point where Keanu Tanevasa has to turn off his replies on his announcements because you got people calling him self-righteous because he has the nerve to post a scripture. You got Smith Snowden calling out Utah fans saying, hey guys, Keanu Tanevasa is actually really awesome. And that's the player you want to keep. And so like that's the culture. And again, the mustache twirling villain is Kalani Sitake. The team that you say, oh, they can't develop defensive guys. You know who develops defensive guys? It's right here at Utah. Meanwhile, in week 8, when you're getting your doors blown off by Arizona State, you're saying, hey, maybe we should give Jay Hill a call and have him be the defensive coordinator instead of Morgan Scalley. You know who else thought that? Keanu Tanevasa. So you're just like him. You also wanted Jay Hill, but the cognitive dissonance of being like, oh, well, BYU doesn't develop guys, but Jay Hill is actually a really good defensive coordinator. Sione Puha developed all of our defensive linemen. Yeah, he's at BYU, but they still suck at developing defensive linemen. Like, what are we doing?
Forgive us for having Elisa Tuiaki recruiting and Preston Hadley. We had a college safety coaching our defensive line for a few years. Like, no wonder we're maybe a couple of years behind the learning curve here. But we're catching up, and we're catching up quick. As soon as, Sione Puha and Jay Hill's recruits get in there along the defensive line. I mean, we stole a legacy player on the defensive line in Ephraim Asiata. We took Hunter Clegg back from his mission. Now we've got Tanuvasa. Like, why are all these, Utah guys that are defensive linemen all coming to play for Jay Hill now? I mean, it's more than just the bag.
Look, and this summarizes, this is my favorite tweet of the day from Salt Lake Jake, who, if you have Twitter, do you know how hard it is to have Salt Lake Jake have a good take? To have Salt Lake Jake be the voice of reason of your fan base? This is what he had to say. I miss the old days when cryptic tweets meant good news for Utah and not we lost our best defensive player to someone other than our main rival. We are down bad worse than any of us can comprehend, and we are now running and celebrating that our best players are going to BYU. Wild and quite pathetically sad, to be honest. And that player went to BYU anyway. It's so bad.
It is wild that in a span of 12 months, in a calendar year, in the year of our Lord, 2024, we went from we are going to run the Big 12, be a college football playoff team, and compete for a national championship. Went from that to, well, yeah, we lost our two best defensive players, but only one of them went to our rival, and our third and fourth best defensive players haven't gone to our rival yet. That's the wins. That's how far we've come. Of like, we are going to run this conference, this poverty conference. We're going to come in here day one. We're the big fish, and we're going to leave to the Big Ten in 2 years' time.
Imagine.
And now it's like, well, Smith Snowden hasn't gone to BYU yet. So,
and by the way,
Cam Calhoun actually went to Alabama, not BYU.
BYU sucks. He went to Bama. and by the way, like, their two most prized wide receiver recruits, like, two of the reasons they thought, oh my gosh, our transfer portal class is amazing, our recruiting class is amazing. Both of them are going, like, they committed to Utah and then announced 2 weeks later they're going somewhere else. Like, normally those guys actually play. Normally they actually play for the program before deciding that, hey, we don't want to be here anymore, but they're getting wise quick.
Imagine doing like a return and report from the beginning of the year, like an accountability as a missionary, where like you have to meet with your leader and talk about your goals and stuff. Like, all right, Utah, like, how'd your football season go? It's like, well, 5-7, lost to BYU, had to fire everyone, had to, just everything's up in the air. Players are transferring. People are going to be like, what kind of, like, how much worse could it get for Utah at this point? Like, especially, I mean, I know pride cometh before the fall and all that stuff, but like, just
enjoy while we have it, man. We went through the 10 years of this, 10 years of being on the opposite side of this. I'm going to enjoy 24 hours. But
it's just like, it's almost like with the athletic director going and kind of embarrassing them with the comments after the game. And then you look at what happened with football this year. You look at what happened with the Pac-12 and Utah's involvement with it, looking at basketball. Like, if you take away a rivalry aspect, just take away the rivalry perspective and just look at it objectively, just as what's on paper. How are more people not getting fired at Utah? Like, how much worse can it get? Like, this is like the dumpster fire, man. This is crazy.
I mean, who are you going to fire, right?
It's just, but
you already fired your offensive coordinator.
It's
you can't fire Whittingham.
You can't fire Whittingham. Whittingham's not going to let them fire Scally.
I'm not saying to fire people. I'm just saying, like, if you take away it's insane how bad things are going there. Like,
I don't understand how they don't have any semblance of a real NIL.
Well, and they do. The problem is they just don't have as much of it. Like, BYU was legitimate. Like, before the season, BYU, they had the donors. Like, clearly the donors are there. They got AJ DeBonsa to come to Provo. But so, like, the money has always been there. It's just How do we use it? And do we trust Kalani Sitake to be the guy to spend it? And after this season, yeah, Kalani's the guy. Kalani is exactly the guy that you want spending that money. And so donors have finally come around, and this offseason, they're throwing bags at guys, and happily so. You don't get Andrew Gentry without a bag. You don't get Hunter Clegg without a bag. You don't get Keanu Tanavasa, whose final three were Alabama, Texas, and BYU. That's the company that you were with, and you have to have NIL that's competitive with that. And so BYU has that, but the reason BYU won Keanu Tanavasa's services beyond the money was because of the relationships that he had with the coaches, with the culture that BYU was building at BYU. And that should terrify everyone, because all it took was a year. Like 10 years, you had every single advantage, and the first year that you don't, and you're on an equal playing field, BYU passes you up in 6 months. Like that's just got to be devastating, man. And again, pride cometh before the fall. This may all completely blow up in our faces, and we're all going to end up on freezing cold takes. But for now, BYU is up.
I'm dying to be on BYU cold takes, by the way. I haven't been on it yet. I just want to have one thing. I just want to feel seen. Okay. I'm gonna mess up. But just one time, please.
If it's gonna happen, it's gonna be my A-Rod takes, let's be honest. Year in review. We've got an hour and a half. Lots to talk
People
about.
Need
boys.
it. An hour and a half, finally, an hour and a half of a sports podcast in the state of Utah that won't just gaslight you into thinking that your rival is promising fake bags of money.
Mount Rushmore. Let's do it.
Mount Rushmore of BYU sporting events in the year of 2024. This is the last episode of 2024. So all encompassing, it's going to encompass the football season. It's going to encompass basketball, anything that happened recruiting wise. I think obviously my 1-1 is going to have to be, as awesome as the football season was, 1-1 is the commitment of AJ DeBansa on my Mount Rushmore of BYU sports moments.
I mean, I got to put him on there too. I'll go with an on-field one. Let's keep it with basketball, beating Kansas in Allen Fieldhouse.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
Those are my first two picks as well.
Beating Utah.
In which I'm actually going to say the Kansas State game. I think like beating Utah was more of a relief. Kansas State was more euphoric of like,
correct,
oh my gosh, this team is actually really good. And I was there. Like it's different when you're in that stadium, the whiteout, the 96 jerseys, the moment was there, and BYU met it in such a huge way that it's hard for me to not say that is the high point of like the highest on field point. The aftermath of the Utah game was awesome. Like all the reminiscing that I did with BYU fans. The podcast that we had after that was awesome. Our 100th episode. So that was a cool moment, but like if it has to be on the field, I'm going to say Kansas State, followed very closely by this Colorado game, because Colorado was the better win of the two.
Yeah, I'm going to say AJ's my 1 seed, beating Kansas. I'm going to say Colorado just because it kind of culminates I feel like the Colorado answer allows you to encompass the entire season because it wraps the bow on the year. And then not to like stray too far from the beaten path, but like banners fly forever. Men and women's cross country both swept the national championships this year. First time in 20 years, a school's won both. I mean, I feel like that just goes to show like how great things are at BYU right now. Like cross country is winning big. Like that just kind of like sets the tone for everything right now. And so I mean, I feel like you have to have one kind of off the wall, not off the wall, but like kind of random answer from Mount Rushmore. Like I think the cross country winning both national championships has to be on there because banners fly forever, right?
I'm going to say the hire of Kevin Young.
That's a good one, dude. There's two. We can't just pick 4, right?
I just did.
If we would have thought about this ahead of time, we would have had an actual like draft and then been like, who had the best list? So it's like people don't have the same things, you know?
You know what? Maybe we have to do that officially. I think maybe let's hold off on definitive lists because I think that'd be a fun offseason.
This is just a live brainstorming.
Yeah.
I was going back through our episodes this year, trying to be like jog my memory of like all the things that have happened. And I got to this episode on May 28th, episode 82. The title of that episode is Biggest Recruiting Win Ever. And I think we were talking about Yegor Demon.
Can that be on BYU Freezing Cold Takes?
And the fact that that was then outdone 6 months later, we're like, this is the biggest recruited win in BYU sports history. And it was Yegor Demon committing to BYU. And then 6 months later, it's like not even close.
and
way more.
Waits in the distance.
Dude, please give me Rider Lions. 2025, man. We're coming.
Oh.
Yeah, well, next week. So next week, I'll be having. Well, I won't be having. My wife will be having a baby. But Monday night, live from the hospital room, we will do our Hypey Award nominees, and we'll actually draft a Mount Rushmore.
Can we
be in Cabo next week, dude? Can we?
Frick.
Podcasting in the hospital while your wife gives birth is like the ultimate dude's rock
moment. Married to the game.
Am I going to be like, yes, I will podcast as my mid-delivery room, and then meanwhile Joe's like, I can't, I'm going to be in Cabo.
Some people are just more dedicated than others, man.
Surely I cannot podcast.
My dad pushed back my labor so he could play in a company softball game. So I think this is kind of like equates. This is like the 2024 version of that, or 2025, I guess, by that point. Podcasting during labor.
I tried to convince Rachel to get induced this week for 2 reasons. One, it'd be nice to do it before the new year so our deductible doesn't reset. And 2, because my work is having our work conference is in New Orleans on January 7th through 9th. On the field at the Superdome 2 weeks before the Super Bowl, we'll be there. And special guest, VIP guest, is Taysom Hill. So I was like, what if you had the baby on the 30th or the 31st, and then I can go to New Orleans? And her response was, you're not leaving me with a 5-day-old baby, even if I were to get induced a week early. To which my response was, why not? But didn't quite fly. But yeah, well, I guess we'll find a time. Joe will be eating tacos in Cabo, I guess. Pre-record maybe Sunday. No, I can't Sunday. Well, we'll figure it out. Either
yeah, well, we don't need to do a scheduling session.
Either way, next week.
Really peaking at the right time on this episode.
Either way, next week's episode we will draft our Mount Rushmore and we'll do our Hypey Award nominations. So should be a good one. And then of course leave it up to the fans to vote on who wins each award. So best time of the year. Any parting thoughts, Jackson? You can make your case or do an early award acceptance speech for recurring guest of the year.
I'm going to do my acceptance speech because I think I'm not to drop the ball at the 1 yard line, but I think I got this one in the bag. It's an honor to be on the foremost elite BYU fan podcast out there. Obviously you guys do the best job breaking down games and putting things in perspective, and you say things that fans want to hear along with things that fans need to hear. I hope to add to the intelligence of the podcast and make people laugh as well. So keep doing what you're doing and keep having me on because I want to repeat next year.
Going for 2 in a row.
You got to campaign in your acceptance speech. You got to keep forward.
Always be recruiting.
Always be recruiting, man. Job's not finished.
Jackson really is from DC. He knew how to do an acceptance speech while also campaigning. Jackson provides some semblance of credibility to this podcast, which is always nice to have every once in a while when we really need it. When something big actually does happen, we're like, we need Jackson on here as some sort of actual journalism.
That can be the verification check mark when needed.
Jackson is our podcast's community note, where it's like, this is real news. We need actual information here.
Speaking of community notes, did you see the "Did Jimmy Carter die today" Twitter account? Oh! No. and they got community notes. It's your whole account. It's just to get that one fact right. Just disgusting.
That's awesome for that account to have been going for that long, and then on the one day he does die, to still be like, no.
The all-time fumble. That is a fumble of the year. What BYU did against Colorado is the opposite of what that account did on Jimmy Carter's death day.
Did he just tweet it too early, or what happened?
Who knows? It's
Either
Jimmy
way.
Carter, man. You can never tell with that guy.
Jimmy Carter by 100, Cougs by 1 billion.
Go Cougs, man.